Who was the Bab? What did he teach? Why was he killed? What relevance does his life and death have for us today? Now let's roll the earth counterclockwise. Let's go closer. Finally, we have reached the land where our story begins, Persia, called the land of the lion and the sun. What were conditions like in 19th century Persia? Modern inventions had not yet penetrated Persia. There were no trains, no system of communication beyond the ship or the horse. Electricity didn't arrive until very late in the century. Unlike its neighbor, the Ottoman Empire, Persia throughout the 19th century lagged behind in military, educational, economic, and social advancement. Women had few rights in Persian society, and their roles were largely confined to that of mother and homemaker. Men had absolute authority over their wives and children, and under the prevailing custom, a man could have up to 4 wives. Poverty and ignorance were widespread. The government had no systems of social welfare or public education. Beggars abounded in every city. Persian women were completely closeted in solitary confinement under their robes. They could be seen but had no voice in public affairs. They did not get the vote until 1963. In those days, the bastinado was a common punishment meted out in public. This consisted of binding the victim's feet to an upraised pole to permit the bottoms to be struck with sticks or whips. After such punishment, walking was well nigh impossible. This man was buried alive for the crime of theft. At the top of society sat the royals, a dynasty of rulers known as the Qajars. This Shah's grandfather had over 1,000 wives and nearly 300 children. Hence the Persian proverb, camels, fleas, and princes exist everywhere. Nearly every government position was purchased by gifts, known by less polite words elsewhere. On October the 20th, 1819, the Bab, meaning the gate, was born in Shiraz, Persia. The Bab's father died when the Bab was still a child, and he was raised by his maternal uncle. Every account of the Bab's childhood indicates that he was an extraordinary child. Many were the reports of his pure character and the charm of his presence. When he was sent to school, he so surprised his schoolmaster with his wisdom and intelligence that the bewildered man took the child back to his uncle and said that he had nothing to teach this gifted pupil. He verily stands in no need of teachers such as I. The Bab became a merchant in his uncle's business. So astute was he that his uncle gave over management of his trading house to him when he was only 20. At the age of 22, the Bab took a wife. She was 21. It was around this same time that a very wise spiritual teacher and his leading disciple were teaching that the advent of a promised Holy One was soon to appear in the world. Their names were Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazem. When Sheikh Ahmad died, his leading disciple, Sayyid Kazem, gave his followers a description of the age and attributes of the promised Holy One. On the last day of 1843, Sayyid Kazem died, but not before he instructed his followers to scatter far and wide in their search for the Promised One, whose appearance was imminent. The disciples scattered far and wide, praying for guidance. Mullah Hossein, foremost disciple of Sayyid Kazem, and his companions reached the outskirts of Shiraz on 22 May 1844. At the city gate to Shiraz, Mullah Hossein instructed his brother and his nephew to proceed to a lodging in the city where he would meet them later for evening prayers. While walking outside the gate, just before sunset, Mullah Hossein saw a young man walking toward him. He greeted him with a smile of loving welcome, embraced him, and invited him to his home. Mullah Hossein pleaded to be excused, as his companions were now awaiting his return. The young man said, "Commit them to the care of God. He will surely protect and watch over them." Mullah Hossein said, "As I followed him, his gait, the charm of his voice, the dignity of his bearing, only enhanced my first impression of him." As Mullah Hossein entered the house, his host uttered this holy verse, "Enter therein peace secure." They ascended the stairs and entered the upper chamber where they were seated. The Bab asked the purpose of Mullah Hossein's journey. Mullah Hossein explained he was searching for the Promised One. The Bab asked what were the proofs this Promised One must give. After Mullah Hossein had cited each one, the Bab exclaimed, "Behold, all these signs are manifest in me." Unasked, the Bab then gave an additional proof known only to Mullah Hossein. With incredible speed, he wrote a commentary on the story of the biblical Joseph, unraveling a mystery that had perplexed Muslim divines for hundreds of years. Mullah Hossein was well nigh overcome with joy. The Bab cautioned him not to tell anyone. He said 18 souls must, uninvited, find him through visions and dreams. Then he would give them each a special mission. Within a short time, the remaining souls found the Bab. To each he wrote a tablet, assigning a specific task. These souls the Bab collectively titled the Letters of the Living. Before sending them on their missions, he called them together. Here are a few sentences of what he said. "O my letters, verily I say, immensely exalted is this day above the days of the apostles of old. Nay, immeasurable is the difference. You are the witnesses of the dawn of the promised day of God. Purge your hearts of worldly desires, and let angelic virtues be your adorning. Strive that by your deeds you may bear witness to the truth of these words of God, and beware lest by turning back he may change you for another people, who shall not be your like, and who shall take from you the kingdom of God." Accompanied by a letter of the living named Qudus and his servant, the Bab set out for Mecca to make his declaration to the keeper of the holiest shrine in Islam. In October 1844, the Bab sailed from the port city of Bushehr in Persia to Jeddah in Arabia. Upon his arrival in Jeddah, the Bab donned the traditional pilgrim's garb. He then mounted a camel and set out on the 40-mile journey to Mecca. In Mecca, pilgrims circumambulate the Kaaba, the holiest shrine in all Islam. Pilgrims pray while circling closer and closer until they are next to the shrine. A black stone is set into one corner of the shrine. Pilgrims often kiss this stone as a sign of reverence. The Bab now stood against the structure of the Kaaba, laid hold of the ring on its door, and thrice repeated in a clear voice, "I am that Qa'im, whose advent you have been awaiting." A sudden hush fell upon the audience. The full implication of those momentous words must, at the time, have eluded that vast concourse of people, but the news of the claim of the young Sayyid soon spread in an ever-widening circle. The last act of the Bab in Mecca was to address a tablet to the sheriff of Mecca, in which he proclaimed his advent and his divine mandate. But the sheriff was preoccupied and ignored the communication put into his hands. Once back in Persia, the Bab then gave instructions to his foremost disciple, Qadush, advising him of the persecution they would soon endure, and promising they would meet again, this time in paradise. Qadush and another follower of the Bab began to teach the new revelation in Shiraz. They were audacious. A loud clamor soon followed. Shia fanatics branded them enemies of Islam. The pair was brought in handcuffs before the merciless provincial governor, Hossein Khan. A book revealed by the Bab to Mullah Hossein on the night of his declaration was taken from them. Hossein Khan read these words aloud: "Divest yourselves of the robe of sovereignty, for he who is the king in truth hath been made manifest." The governor indignantly wanted to know if he and the Shah should surrender their leadership to this new messenger. In so many words he was told yes, they should. The governor was furious. He ordered the man stripped and whipped with 1,000 lashes. He then commanded that the beards of both men should be burned, their noses pierced, and through this incision a cord should be passed, and with this halter they should be led through the streets of the city as an object lesson of the penalty for heresy. The governor then ordered his personal guards to arrest the Bab and bring him in chains to his presence. Before the guards could seek out the Bab, he found them and surrendered himself. So surprised were they didn't put him in chains. The Bab was brought before Hossein Khan, who publicly insulted him, blaming him for disgracing the holy faith of Islam. The Bab responded with a quotation from the Quran that inflamed the governor. He ordered his attendant to strike the Bab in the face, which he did with such violence that the Bab's turban fell to the ground. The chief mullah of Shiraz, impressed by the Bab's quoted verse, intervened, saying the matter required great care. He then questioned the Bab, asking if he was the Qa'im's representative. The Bab denied he was. The mullah then demanded the Bab publicly deny this in the city's main mosque on the coming Friday. That Friday the Bab mounted the pulpit and said, "The condemnation of God be upon him who regards me either as a representative of the Qa'im or the gate thereof." Of course, the Bab wasn't the representative of the promised Qa'im. He was the promised Qa'im. It was around this time that the king of Persia, Muhammad Shah, delegated his top religious expert to interrogate the Bab and report back his findings. Not only did the Bab answer all his questions satisfactorily, he even answered an unasked question that the divine had told himself would be the ultimate proof he was the promised one. The divine became a Babi and resolved to devote his life to his cause. At that time, the Shah had put the entire government into the hands of his prime minister, Haji Mirza Agassi. Agassi was also the Shah's chief spiritual advisor. He is known to history as the Antichrist of the Bab's revelation. The Shah then ordered the governor of Esfahan, who was hosting the Bab, to send him on to Tehran. But the sinister prime minister prevented the Bab from meeting the Shah and had him sent instead to the remote prison fortress of Maku, where he would languish for 9 long months. In April 1848, the Bab was transferred to yet another remote fortress. This time it was to Charik, which he designated as the Grievous Mountain. At Charik, the Bab was under strict confinement by the order of the Prime Minister. Nevertheless, shortly thereafter, the warden, Yahya Khan, felt the love of the Bab penetrate his heart and claim his entire being. So too the Kurdish inhabitants of that place began to invoke his name and clamor to seek his blessing. Once again the meddling Prime Minister intervened. In July of 1848, he ordered the Bab brought from Charik to Tabriz to be examined by a panel of religious experts. The most distinguished doctors of divinity were assembled together in Tabriz. Also present in that gathering was the 17-year-old crown prince, Nasruddin Mirza, then the governor of Tabriz, and who, in just 3 months, would become the reigning Shah of Persia. The Bab was ushered in. A deep, mysterious silence suddenly fell upon the gathering. The only vacant seat was reserved for the crown prince. Without hesitation, the Bab sat in it. The president of the proceedings broke the silence, asking, "Whom do you claim to be, and what is the message you have brought?" The Bab responded, I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word and to pledge allegiance to my person. The chief mullah insolently reprimanded the Bab, "You wretched and immature lad of Shiraz," saying that he was attempting to foment turmoil in the province. The Bab responded, "I have not come hither of my own accord. I have been summoned to this place." It was decided that the priest, who is the highest religious authority in Tabriz, should administer punishment to the Bab. 11 times he struck the Bab on the bottom of his feet. One of his errant blows struck the Bab on the face. Later the same year, this priest was struck with paralysis and died. It's at this time we get our first glimpse of the Bab through Western eyes. After the bastinado was inflicted on the Bab, the Crown Prince's personal physician was sent to attend him, along with 2 Persian doctors. They were to ascertain whether the Bab was sane or not. The prince's physician was Dr. William Cormack. He later wrote, "The Bab was a very mild and delicate-looking man, rather small in stature and very fair for a Persian, with a melodious, soft voice, which struck me much. As the Bab was aware of my having been sent with 2 other doctors to see whether he was of sane mind or merely a madman, he was loath to answer any questions put to him. To all inquiries he merely regarded us with a mild look, chanting in a low melodious voice some hymns, I suppose." 2 other of the Bab's friends were also present, who were subsequently put to death. He only once deigned to answer me on my saying I was not a Muslim and was willing to know something about his religion, as I might perhaps be inclined to adopt it. He regarded me very intently on my saying this and replied that he had no doubt of all Europeans coming over to his religion. Our report to the Shah at that time was of a nature to spare his life. After his ordeal, the Bab was returned to the fortress castle of Cherik, where he languished for nearly 2 more years. During this time, over 300 followers of the Bab were entrapped by the Shah's army and were brutally slaughtered. 2 of the Bab's foremost disciples, Mullah Hossein and Qudus, perished in this battle. The chief minister of the Shah, called the Emir Kabir, signed the death warrant of the Bab. The Bab was taken under guard from Cherik to Tabriz in June 1850 and again installed in the building known as the Ark. In early July, guards came to his cell to escort the Bab and his secretary to the barracks where they would be held until the time for execution. Guards took away the Bab's green turban and waist sash, the 2 emblems of his noble lineage. Under guard, the Bab and his amanuensis were conducted through the streets of Tabriz en route to the barracks where he was to be executed. Suddenly a young man pushed through the crowds of onlookers. Breathless with excitement and exhausted with fatigue, he flung himself at the feet of the Bab, and seizing the hem of his garment, passionately implored him, "Send me not from thee, O Master! Wherever thou goest, suffer me to follow thee." Amazingly, the Bab addressed him by name and said, "Arise and rest assured that you will be with me. Tomorrow you shall witness what God has decreed." Witnesses reported that that night the face of the Bab was aglow with joy, a joy such had never before shone from his countenance. He said, "Tomorrow will be the day of my martyrdom." Early the next morning, while the Bab was speaking with his secretary, a guard interrupted him. The Bab said, "Not until I have said to him all the things I wish to say can any earthly power silence me." The guard then conducted the Bab to his commander, Sam Khan. Sam Khan spoke to the Bab, "I profess the Christian faith and entertain no ill will against you. If your cause be the cause of truth, enable me to free myself from the obligation to shed your blood." The Bab said, "Follow your instructions, and if your intent be sincere, the Almighty is surely able to relieve you from your perplexity." Thousands crowded the rooftops to catch a glimpse of the Bab and his companion en route to the place of execution. The Bab and his companion were suspended by ropes from a spike driven into the wall of the barracks. The head of the young man was placed against the chest of the Bab. At the command to fire, the smoke from hundreds of black powder muskets filled the barrack square, blotting out the sun. As soon as the cloud of smoke had cleared away, an astounded multitude was looking upon a scene which their eyes could scarcely believe. There, standing before them, alive and unhurt, was the companion of the Bab, whilst the Bab himself had vanished from their sight. After a frenzied search, they found him, seated, unruffled, uninjured, in the same room which he had occupied the night before, engaged in completing his interrupted conversation. The Bab calmly said to the guard, "Now you may proceed to fulfill your intention." Sam Khan resolutely refused to attempt a second execution, even should it cost him his life. As Sam Khan's soldiers were leaving, the colonel of the bodyguard volunteered to carry out the order for execution. It was now noon on the 9th of July, 1850. Before the muskets were fired, the Bab addressed the 10,000 onlookers. "Had you believed in me, O wayward generation, every one of you would have followed the example of this youth, who stood in rank above most of you, and willingly would have sacrificed himself in my path. The day will come when you have recognized me. That day I shall have ceased to be with you." The very moment the shots were fired, a gale of exceptional severity swept over the whole city. A whirlwind of dust of incredible density obscured the light of the sun and blinded the eyes of the people. The bullet-riddled body of the Bab was cast into a moat to be eaten by dogs. Devoted Babis rescued it and hid it for nearly 50 years. The body of the Bab now rests in glory in the Holy Land, in the bosom of Mount Carmel, where it is a point of pilgrimage for all Baha'is. Following the martyrdom of the Bab, the persecution against his followers increased all over the country. Thousands were brutally put to death in ways so heinous we show only one of the milder forms of execution here. Now we will address the question posed at the beginning. What did the Bab teach? A core idea is that God has a plan to spiritualize mankind because we are essentially spiritual beings. Like pupils in a school, we advance as our understanding increases. This process is called progressive revelation. Roughly every 500 to 1,000 years, God sends his heavenly messenger to take humanity another step forward. Among those messengers were Krishna, Moses, Buddha, Christ, Muhammad, and the twin messengers of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Their spiritual teachings address the needs of the soul. Their social teachings address the needs of the age in which they appear. Baha'u'llah declared, "This is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future." The Bab's mission was to prepare humanity for global transformation. This went well beyond the provincial thinking of the time. His duty was to give the message. Their duty, use God's words to purify their hearts. His message challenged the narrow perspective of hidebound beliefs that divided the world into the categories of infidel and non-infidel. Though there are many specific teachings of the Bab, there is not time to enumerate them here. We should note, however, that the Bab elevated the status of women, going so far as to appoint the far-famed Tahirih as one of his disciples. The second part of the Bab's mission was to prepare humanity for him whom God will make manifest. Like John the Baptist, the Bab had to prepare for an even greater advent, the coming of the promised one of all religions. Babis who survived the massacres embraced the faith of Baha'u'llah, who was him whom God would make manifest. Baha'u'llah's name means the glory of God. The Bab addressed a tablet to Baha'u'llah in the shape of a star consisting of 360 derivations of the word Baha. Persecution of the Baha'is of Iran has been almost constant for well nigh 170 years. In the early 1980s, the beautiful house of the Bab in Shiraz was reduced to rubble by religious fanatics. In 2004, the house of Baha'u'llah in Tehran was destroyed by enemies of the faith. And recently, the house of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad has been destroyed. That's 3 Baha'i holy places in recent memory. Currently, 7 Baha'is, our brothers and sisters, completed 5 years of a 20-year sentence. Their crime, believing in the Bab and Baha'u'llah and refusing to recant those beliefs. In the words of a U.S. government official, the plight of the 7 Baha'i leaders is emblematic of the persecution suffered by the entire Baha'i community there and also of other religious minorities in Iran. The Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette, Illinois holds one living treasure originating from the hand of the Bab. Upstairs in the temple is an orange tree. Through a fortuitous chain of events, seeds from an orange tree of the Bab's house in Shiraz have become a living legacy here in this holiest house of worship. Let us close this program with a quotation from the Bab. Well is it with him who fixeth his gaze upon the order of Baha'u'llah, and rendereth thanks unto his Lord.